Xia Dynasty, often called the first dynasty of China. Now, you might have heard that the Xia Dynasty was once thought to be more myth than reality, kind of like a legend passed down through the ages. But thanks to some serious archaeological work in the 20th century, we found evidence that matches up with old historical accounts, suggesting that the Xia might have actually existed. So, who were these Xia people? Well, they ruled from around 2070 to 1600 BCE, and were the first to bring in the concept of dynastic succession in China. That basically means they passed down power through family lines, setting up what would become a long-standing tradition in Chinese history. However, not everyone agrees that the Xia dynasty was real. Some experts think the story of the Xia was cooked up by later dynasties, like the Zhou, to show that earlier rulers lost their power because they weren't morally fit to rule. They argue that the Xia was just a kind of made-up cautionary tale. But here's the twist: no one can fully explain why the physical evidence found at these ancient sites doesn't support this theory. Yet, on the flip side, those who believe the Xia dynasty was real haven't been able to definitively prove that the sites belong to the Xia either. They could easily be from the early Shang dynasty, which came after. Now let's rewind even further to the rise of the Xia. According to ancient historians like Shima Qian, there was this legendary figure named Huang Ti, or the Yellow Emperor. He's credited with creating Chinese culture and laying down the foundations for government, music, silk production, laws, and even medicine and agriculture. Pretty impressive, right? After his rule, his grandson Zhuangxu, who was one of the 5 emperors, went on to establish the Xia tribe. The Xia's first big ruler was Emperor Yao. He's remembered as a wise philosopher king who really cared about his people. Under his leadership, small villages started growing into urban centers. But Yao had one major headache. The Yellow River kept flooding, causing all sorts of chaos, ruining crops and displacing people. So, Yao put a guy named Gun in charge of fixing the problem. Gun tried for nearly a decade to control the flooding. He even built dikes to hold back the water, but things just got worse. The dikes eventually broke, leading to even more destruction. By this time, Yao had passed on the leadership to his successor, Emperor Shun. Shun was not happy with Gun's failure. Depending on which version of the story you hear, Gun either took his own life, was imprisoned, or simply went into exile. After Gun was out of the picture, Shun turned to Gun's son, Yu, to finish the job. And after Yu's father, Gun, failed to control the relentless floods of the Yellow River, Yu stepped up and learned from his father's mistakes. Unlike Gun, who tried to fight against nature, Yu understood that working with nature was the key. He didn't try to do it all on his own either. Instead, Yu rallied the nearby tribes, and together they built a network of canals that guided the water safely to the sea, instead of letting it wreak havoc on their lands. This wasn't an overnight success. Yu's work took 13 long years. And during all that time, Yu was so committed to his mission that he didn't even visit his home, not once, even though he passed right by it 3 times. His wife and young son would call out to him as he passed, urging him to come home, and his fellow workers would suggest he take a break. But Yu was determined. He knew that so many people had lost their homes and families to the floods, and he just couldn't bring himself to rest until the problem was solved. His dedication inspired everyone around him, and together they finally managed to control the river and stop the floods. Impressed by Yu's success, Emperor Shun placed him in charge of the army. Yu didn't just stop at taming the river, he also led his forces against the San Mao, a neighboring tribe that had been causing trouble for the Xia by constantly raiding their borders. Yu defeated them and drove them away, earning the respect and admiration of his people. In recognition of all his achievements, Shun named Yu as his heir, marking the official start of the Xia dynasty. Yu's rule laid the foundation for a stable government. He organized the vast land into 9 provinces, making it easier to manage and govern. He ruled for an impressive 45 years and, when he was on his deathbed, he chose his son Qi as his successor. Originally, Yu had planned to pass the throne to one of his ministers, not wanting to burden his son with the responsibilities of ruling. But Qi had become so beloved by the people, partly because of the stories of how his father never came home during the Great Flood, that Yu couldn't deny them. Qi's reign marked the beginning of dynastic succession in China, where power was passed down through family lines. Although Qi himself was a capable ruler, the dynasty's fortunes fluctuated with each successive ruler. Some, like the great hero Shao Kang, revitalized the nation and became legendary figures. Others, like Kong Jia, who preferred drinking to ruling, and the tyrant Jia, who lost the mandate of heaven, led the dynasty into decline. Ultimately, Jia's misrule paved the way for the rise of the Shang dynasty, which overthrew the Xia and took control of the land. And the ancient history of China, let's dig into the debate surrounding the Xia dynasty. For a long time, people thought the Xia dynasty was more myth than reality. From the 1920s all the way until the mid-1960s, many scholars believed that the stories of the Xia were just legends, passed down through generations but not rooted in actual history. The reason for this skepticism was simple. There wasn't much early evidence or written records to back up the existence of the Xia, and no physical artifacts had been found that could definitively prove they were real. This skepticism was largely fueled by the idea that historians, especially the well-known Sima Qian, may have invented the Xia dynasty. The thought was that Sima Qian and others wanted to create a kind of model dynasty, a blueprint to explain how and why dynastic changes happened in China. According to this view, the Xia dynasty served as an example of how rulers could lose the mandate of heaven, a divine right to govern, if they misruled. This idea of the dynastic cycle was important in Chinese history. A new regime would rise, enjoy the mandate of heaven, but eventually, corruption would lead to their downfall, making way for another dynasty to take over. But here's where things get interesting. Starting in the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists began uncovering evidence that seemed to match the old stories about the Xia. They found palaces and homes with 4 walls, which was a big deal because earlier homes were usually round. These discoveries lined up with the descriptions of Xia structures written about by historians long after the dynasty was supposed to have ended. This challenged the idea that the Xia was purely mythological. However, even with these findings, the debate didn't end. No written records have been found that explicitly label these structures as belonging to the Xia dynasty, so there's still no definitive proof. This means the argument over whether the Xia dynasty was a real historical dynasty or just a politically motivated creation by later writers continues to this day. So, was the Xia dynasty a real chapter in Chinese history or just a story crafted to explain the rise and fall of rulers? That's a question that might never be fully answered, but it's fascinating to see how history and legend can intertwine, leaving us to wonder about the truth behind these ancient tales.